All right, welcome to the history of war. We're pretty much finished with talking about um, Alexander the Great and all of his shenanigans. There's a couple more battles we could look at, but we're not going to take the time to. We've simply got to move on to the next phase of our study, which is going to be focused on an age of empires. Now, there have been many empires throughout the world. Alexander the Great built the Greek Empire, the Macedonian Empire, if you prefer. But the Persian Empire lived before then. And, you could argue that Babylon was an empire, and possibly there was an Egyptian empire, and, various things like that. That's all well and good, okay? So in other words, the age of empires really dates back as far back in history as we can tell. Okay, just about, at least to the let's say that the Middle Kingdom of Egypt or something like that. In this series, we're going to actually look at a war between what you might call two empires. Okay, so first of all, Alexander the Great's empire kind of collapses. Speaking of kind of collapsing under your own weight, his empire is so large and so diverse that in many cases, well, it's just so far from Greece. The Persian culture is quite a bit different from the Greek culture. Persian language quite a bit different, and the Greeks aren't super comfortable there. Many of them would prefer to just go back to Greece. Okay. Now there is a large Greek presence in Egypt, and okay, they're a lot closer, aren't they? Okay, and the Greeks have traded with them for years. When you start talking about the Indus River Valley, when you start talking about present-day Afghanistan, for crying out loud, that's ways off. Okay, across a desert and a sea, and many years to travel that far. So anyway, my point is that right after Alexander's death, when Alexander dies, and he's probably assassinated, by the way, we used to think that he succumbed to one of his war wounds, and we now sort of think that that's really not what happened. That Alexander the Great was definitely wounded in a battle, and the wound was apparently rather serious, but that he basically recovered, and that shortly after that, or right around that same time period, one of his, or many of his soldiers sort of mutinied on him. And I forget the exact details, but they it's something like he wanted to send some of the oldest ones back to Greece, and some of the ones that had been injured to the point that they really couldn't fight very well. And they got really mad at him. They all mutinied. They didn't want to fight anymore, and they just all wanted to go back to Greece. They've been away from home for 4 or 5 years at this point. Some of them longer than that. And they were just done. Right? There's a season of your life when you're out there trying to conquer the world, and eventually you just get to the point where you want to settle down, and you just want a house, and you want some kids, and you just want to sort of enjoy the fruits of your labor. And keep in mind, a lot of Alexander the Great's soldiers are older than he is, right? Which is kind of unusual. Oftentimes, the military-aged males are 25, 30 years old. In this case, I think a lot of Alexander the Great's soldiers are, significantly older than that, maybe 10 or 15 years older than that. They had fought with, under his father. So long story short, Alexander the Great shames them into calming down and agreeing to, stick around and fight a few more battles. And he's planning additional conquests when he dies under suspicious circumstances. Basically, he drinks some wine. He says, "This kind of tastes funny," and then he dies from it. So there's probably a video that explains that. I'll see if I can find it. Anyway, so right after Alexander the Great kicks the bucket, his empire sort of falls apart. And what happens is you got all these generals under Alexander the Great. I believe Parmenion is one of them, and the commander of the infantry, and some other ones. That sort of divided up Alexander the Great's empire, and you get Greece proper, okay, including Macedon, which I want to say is still ruled by Antipater, and then you have Ptolemaic Egypt, which is ruled by the Greeks for many centuries after this, 2 centuries, something like that. Cleopatra is the last of the Ptolemaic Greeks, the only one apparently to have actually spoken Egyptian, so that's new for her. She's kind of an interesting character. She lived about the same time as Julius Caesar. Okay, so several hundred years into the future after this. Okay, but anyway, so long story short, the Greek Empire doesn't last a very long time, and they kind of start fighting amongst themselves pretty quickly. Seemingly, that's what humans do, and the Greek Empire is eventually going to fall to Rome, and we'll kind of talk about why that is when we get to that point of Roman history. So the prelude to what we're looking at right now with this sort of map of the Mediterranean, the Western Mediterranean here, which is sort of divided up between Carthage and Rome at this point, right before the first Punic War, which is going to happen somewhere around 264 BC. Now remember, Alexander the Great is fighting his battles in like 330, 335, about that time frame. I think want to see the Battle of Gaugamela is 331 BC, somewhere in that neighborhood. So we're talking about a time period that's roughly 70 years after the fall of Tyre. Now remember, that had been prophesied about in the Old Testament, that Tyre, there wouldn't even be a stone left on top of another stone of old Tyre. And that was, of course, true because Alexander the Great used that building material to construct his causeway out to New Tyre. And if you've seen the video from the earlier PowerPoint, eventually breaks into the city with a battering ram aboard a ship, of all things, and conquers New Tyre. And recall that before the siege of Tyre, the Tyrrhenians had sent out almost all of their women and children, had evacuated them, and almost all of those go to Carthage. Okay, Alexander the Great does spare some of the citizens of New Tyre, all the ones that fled to the sanctuary of the temple. It turns out that temples are regarded as kind of off limits even before Christian temples become a thing. So those that fled to the temple, he spares, and that's kind of a nice thing to do, but not necessarily, some kind of hard and fast rule. Okay, he sells all the other Tyrrhenians into slavery, and yeah, a lot of them are killed in the fighting that ensues. So these Tyrrhenians and other refugees from Alexander's wake, many of them head to another Phoenician city called Carthage. Okay, now Carthage is a very interesting place. It had originally been a Phoenician colony. Now, if you look at the map here, you see some smaller, city-states sort of around Carthage. I want to emphasize there were actually dozens of them. Okay, most of them were quite small. We see the major ones there, but many of them are Phoenician city-states. Okay, and Phoenician colonies, and they trade with one another. Carthage had started a lot later than some of the Phoenician colonies, and it had always been kind of a backwaters. And we're still not quite sure why Carthage rises to